I'm going in a little bit of a different direction today. The last couple times I've preached here, I've kind of geeked out and gone into history and like this deep dive into linguistics and kind of attempted a little bit of an academic lecture to some degree. And today's sermon is a little bit more on the emotional end of things. I always consult the commentary on the suggested liturgical reading, but today it just felt like there's something in, yes, my own history, but probably some of our collective communal histories that relate to this reading. So I'm backing off from history and context and translation, construction, and talking about some personal experiences and community experiences. However, as always, I want to extract from the text what we can learn about ourselves and the world and God from the scripture, and what positive changes we can make in our lives and in the world through our interactions with God and with others. In our scripture reading, Bartimaeus was waiting for Jesus by the roadside outside Jericho. And as he was waiting, he and the disciples were leaving the city. Bartimaeus was blind. The NRSV refers to him as a beggar. Not sure how I feel about that wording, but he was referred to as a blind beggar. Bartimaeus hears that the men passing him are with Jesus, so he calls out for Jesus to help him. He's been waiting for Jesus to come by, apparently for some time now, but when he calls out for Jesus, others surrounding Jesus hold Bartimaeus back from Jesus. And I'm going to pause here, and I'll get to the rest. I know it's not always said outright like this, but who here has ever felt people holding you back from reaching for Jesus? And you can raise your hands as you start to identify with anything here. Have you ever felt like followers of Christ were telling you, no, you're not good enough to approach this man. This is our Jesus, and you're not good enough to come to him. You're not good enough to be in our congregation. You don't have your life together enough to walk through those doors yet. Get your life in order before you come to this community. You're still addicted? Come back when you're sober. You're not pretty enough yet. You're not sober. You're not straight enough yet. You're not conservative or progressive enough for my Jesus. Does this ring a bell with anyone? Okay, thought it might. Okay, since I've already welcomed everyone with so many words, I'm going to offer this as well. If ever, God forbid, you feel cast out of this community, you are loved by God. Jesus wants you to come to him, whether his followers think you're good enough or not. If you hear this sermon and think I'm some hippie radical leftist or some fanatical fundamentalist, and I've heard both actually, you are welcomed in God's arms, whether or not you feel comfortable in mine. I hope you do. But no matter how you feel about the church or how you feel about Christians, you are God's beloved child. When you cry out for God, yes, there are people who try to stand in the way. It's kind of like, did you guys ever hear about how the Queen had these attendants who would make sure before you see her that you know the right language to use around the Queen, and how to swizzle your spoon properly in the tea in front of royalty, and never ever have your back to her? They think God is like the Queen. And I'm sorry, but God sees your backside and your front side, and sees you mix Jack into your tea and swizzle your stick around erratically. And God sees you before you do it and as you do it, and loves you however you live your life. And somehow people want to make you presentable before God, as if God didn't see you already before you got here. I feel like we all have that friend who wants to get in shape, but says stuff like, I'm not in shape enough to go to the gym yet. Now, if you have a heart condition and you can't exercise, at risk of hurting yourself, that's different. Talk to your doctor before starting any workout regimen and don't see your pastor. But typically, people at the gym are glad you're there. They will help you if you ask for a spot, and they'll congratulate you on your progress. No one at the gym goes, "Bro, did you see that guy walk in? He's not muscular enough to be here yet." We don't do that. Gym goers will help you with your form and help you prevent injury and achieve goals. The church needs to learn from people at the gym. And I'm sorry, at least at my gym, I know that's not everyone's experience. But when people come here, spiritually broken, feeling unwelcome in other places, we don't need to be a block between them and God. I'll come back to this concept because I think there's a whole sermon's worth of things to say on that. And a long list of experiences we can share on feeling unwelcomed in the church. But I'm going to finish the story and we'll come back. Jesus tells his disciples to let Bartimaeus come to him. That's important. No matter who is holding you back, and no matter what people tell you Jesus wants from you, Jesus is not complicit to their roadblock to Christ. That sounds like a really terrible book title, The Roadblock to Christ. Actually, as I was writing this sermon, I looked up whether that was a book or not already, because just my luck, I would mention that, and somebody would be sitting in the front row who published that book a few years ago, but it's not a book. Bartimaeus refers to Jesus as Son of David, not Son of God, not Son of Joseph, but Son of David. In the final days of Jesus' ministry, the temple was a central figure. It was almost like one of the main characters. And the Jewish roots of Christ's message and ministry are kind of bold printed in this part of the Gospels. After this interaction, Jesus, yes, tells some parables, travels to Jerusalem, does some remarkable things, but this is the last personal, miraculous healing of another person before the crucifixion, at least in the Gospel of Mark. It's an odd healing passage, because if you remember Jesus healing other people, or Jesus healing another blind man in the Gospel of Matthew, there's this kind of gross passage where Jesus spits in the dirt and makes mud and pushes it into this guy's face and heals his eyes. It seems kind of gross and intrusive, but in a weird and violent way, more personal and intimate. Jesus comes into contact with another person's eyes and heals them. This guy, Bartimaeus, yells for Jesus through a crowd. And Jesus basically says, "You are healed," and he can see. I find some significance also in the fact that Mark says Bartimaeus then becomes a follower of Christ. It sounds like this is what this man wanted all along, and his blindness, or other people's perception of what his blindness meant, and also poverty, was keeping him from being able to follow. I'd like to take that metaphor to the nth degree and say that whatever your version of blindness is, or poverty is, however people think you can't be a follower, Jesus never said that. By the way, I feel like that could be a great sermon series, just, I never said that, guys. Jesus speaks healing on this man. It's weird because he usually puts a hand on someone. But I thought about the theological significance, going back to Jesus' Jewish roots, and all I can come up with is that Jesus' last healing was analogous to God's first creation. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. This man calls Jesus Son of David, and Jesus does the thing that's at the very root of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, the very first chapter of Genesis. he speaks something into existence. Then it was creation, and now it is healing. Now, maybe Jesus also knew that this man was going to follow him after his healing, and knew that the close physical interaction would come at some point. Unfortunately, I don't know what happened with Bartimaeus after this interaction, because that's where the disciples stopped writing about him. I will say, though, that I'm glad that they got his name this time. If you've heard me preach about the Samaritan woman at the well or the founder of the Ethiopian church, I'm always like, that person was important. Why didn't you get that person's name? But you have to recognize that as the disciples traveled with Jesus, they actually started to get better with this kind of thing. They screw up royally several times, but the longer they're with them, the more they, under normal circumstances, see humanity in others better. Yes, Peter goes all Van Gogh on the guy's ear in Gethsemane, and yes, Judas's betrayal. But most of the disciples had a good self-improvement arc over their journey with Christ. Sound familiar? So maybe, as a church, we need to stop standing in the way of people walking with Jesus, and instead allow them to improve as a result of their relationship with him. As far as my walk with God goes, yeah, I know it's stereotypical, but I felt like a lot of people tried to install roadblocks between me and God as I was coming out of the closet. I technically didn't come out, I was outed. I was ready to stay in there. There are shoes in the closet. That's where I keep my 20 scarves. It's comfortable in there. But one person who is very important to me said something when I was outed that made me very angry. I knew I wanted to go into ministry when I was 12. The first time I admitted to this person that I was gay, they said, I guess you're not going into ministry anymore. Okay. I'm a little bit defiant and rebellious at times. It's a character flaw. And let me tell you, if I were not already planning on going into ministry, I would have gone into ministry just to spite them, which is not a good reason to go into it. But the process of coming out started so much drama with me and with the church. I left churches. I stopped supporting ministries. It was painful, but I started recognizing the ways that religious entities that I loved were suppressing other people who were crying out for God. Women were not allowed to preach. Gay people were not allowed to talk about their relationships. Couples where one person is black and one person is white were told, I don't know if you guys should be having kids because they'll deal with some of the discrimination that you guys face by whatever you're putting into the community. Well, change the community. Make the community care more about love than appearances. Listen to women's experiences and testimonies about God. Celebrate when two people love each other without specifying who gets to love each other. Tell people when they are not ministering to the disciples because of the words of the Pharisees. One of my favorite passages to preach on, as you probably know because you've heard it a couple times, is Mark 7, where Jesus tells the Pharisees, you all do an excellent job of ignoring the commandments of your God in order to keep the traditions of your elders. So, if you care so much about keeping traditions that you don't think about the greatest two commandments being love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself, then you missed the point of any of the instructions in the Bible. Any instruction is given as a way to show you how to love God or love another person better. And if you can use them as a tool to keep you from loving someone, you're using it wrong. Conversely, If you have ever been told that you can't love someone, or you can't love God, or that God doesn't love you, or you have to change first in order for God to love you, then that person is like the crowd holding Bartimaeus back from Jesus. As you are crying out for Jesus, Jesus is telling them, like in this story, to get out of the way so that he can heal you and you can follow him. If they didn't listen to Jesus, I'm sorry. I've been there. I know it can be scary letting everyone in. When someone comes into our space who is struggling with homelessness, or someone comes in who has scars on her arms from using drugs, or someone comes in who doesn't yet understand their identity or whom they love, when someone has been held back from God by the rest of the crowd of the church, we need to get out of the way and remind them that God is already with them. God already loves them. And stop being the roadblock between them and God.